everybody, and welcome to our Leaders in Astrology series. Today, I am privileged to be joined by highly esteemed author, professor, and historian of astrology and cultural astronomy, Dr. Nick Campion. So thank you so much for joining us today, and how are you doing?
It's a pleasure, Callum. I'm very fond of KeplerCollege, so it's really a great pleasure to be talking to you.
Wonderful. It's a very much an honor for me. So as we do in this series, I'd love to start at the beginning of your astrological journey. So can you tell us how you first became interested in astrology and what that early environment was like?
Yes, and it's a story that becomes increasingly part of my memory the older I get, which was when I was about 6 or 7 years old. I remember my mother reading the horoscopes out of the newspaper at breakfast. It was quite a feature of our daily breakfast routine. And I was, even at that young age, I was struck by the fact that the newspaper, which I was just beginning to read, was about yesterday's events. But the horoscope column was about what was going to take place during the day, the quality of the day to come. And this just lodged itself in my brain as something of great fascination. And then my brother and me, my mother and father, zodiac signs all in a row. So I'm Sun in Pisces, my mother in Aries, my father Taurus, my brother in Gemini. And, somehow that just seemed to me to form a pattern. And, I later found out a lot of astrology is based around pattern interpretation. So that just struck me. And so this just became a whole fascinating concept for me. I didn't know how to find anything else out or anything. I never even spoke about it. It just stayed there. There was another actually completely separate development at the time, also to do with the sky and space, that I found absolutely riveting and is not astrological, but has since come together in my academic career. And that was the beginning of the space race. And I remember the first days of the US space race. Obviously, I remember the Soviet space race as well, which was earlier, but the US space race was obviously broadcast to us. And my memory is of sitting in front of television on a Saturday afternoon, which seemed to me when the launches always took place, waiting for maybe an hour for something to happen, and then the countdown would begin with this sort of mechanical precision, and then there'd be this enormous eruption as the space rocket lifted off with a capsule on top of it with a man or then 2 or 3 men inside it shooting up into space. And I just couldn't believe it. Nobody else I knew was interested in this at all. So again, it was a very internal thing. But this which I remember from the first days of the American space race, I say, just planted in my imagination the idea of journeying to the stars. And I was always a fan of science fiction, Doctor Who, and then Star Trek began in the late 60s and so on. So there's these two currents which have always been intertwined. Regarding the strictly astrological, in 1965, we were taking a family holiday in the Norfolk Broads, which you'll know about, which are in the east of England. It was a boating holiday. And I went into a tourist shop, and there was a rack of little coloured envelopes. And on the front of the envelopes was written words like Aries, Taurus, and there was Pisces. And I thought, wow, this is, somebody else knows about this stuff. So I bought it, and it was Pisces, Your Stars by Madame Francesca. And so then it said, send 10 shillings, which is, let's call that $1 to convert roughly, to Madam Francesca, to Madam Francesca of Brighton, and get your full horoscope reading. And so I sent off my 10 shillings, and a few weeks later, this full horoscope reading arrived. And it was, of course, it was about, I don't know, 4 or 5 duplicated sheets of description of the sun sign Pisces. And I remember finding it so rivetingly true. It felt like I was being understood for the first time. And that was another major stage. Of course, looking back, I've since now I spend a long time sort of still evaluating that experience and the nature of truth and how words can speak to you, and how words that you read or hear in the right moment have a huge amount of meaning. So, because I'm always in my mind juggling the skeptical critiques of astrology, like how can 1/12 of the world's population share these characteristics, and also the arguments of astrologers that sun sign astrology has no value because you have to consider the moon, the ascendant, etc., etc., etc. But there it was. It was a peak experience for me.
Did you, talking about your family, did you have anyone to speak to about what you've been reading and learning in those early stages? Was your mother interested, or your brothers, or was it just you in the family? Was there any environment where you could speak and bounce ideas off others, or was it just internalized?
No, just me.
Just
Just me. I did in my mid-teens. I had a great uncle in Australia who was using astrology to buy gold mines, and of course this was in the days when it was very difficult to find anything out about astrology. So my aunt in London had to go to a bookshop in London and buy him some books to mail out to Australia. And then again, I didn't talk to anybody about this, but I thought, aha, there's my great uncle who I never met who knows about this stuff. The first time I met anybody else who knew anything about astrology, I was hitchhiking through southern England on my way to spend, I think, the solstice at Stonehenge, and then go to a festival at Glastonbury. And this is 1971. And I was hitchhiking, and I got picked up by a van of people with long hair. And one of them, who's, I can still remember him today, he just turned to me and said, "Hey man, what's your sign?" Which was, a classic greeting of the time. And I just and I thought this was the first time that anybody had ever mentioned anything about astrology to me. So from the age of about 6 or 7, it had been this secret thing that had fascinated me. And I couldn't believe it that there in this passing van was somebody who asked me what my sign was. So
So furthering your research, did you get your hands on any other books as you were developing, starting to research or read more about astrology? And who were those early astrologers in terms of the inspiration for continuing your study?
It was very difficult then. I went to second-hand bookshops. Back then you couldn't, use the internet, which spoils us so much, to find out what anybody was saying about astrology. So there were lots of second-hand bookshops, and I would go to shop, and if I found a book on astrology, I'd buy it. I bought a book by Rupert Gleadow, which was a general book on the history of astrology and a bit about what it was about. But it was, you couldn't, there was no way to access it unless you somehow found the right medium to do so. So one day I was by then a student at Cambridge University studying history, and one day another student in my college found out that people were saying, "Oh, Nick Campion's interested in astrology," and this other student came straight round to see me with a copy of a book called "Teach Yourself Astrology" by Jeff Mayo, and this was a part of a mass series, the Teach Yourself books. You could teach yourself anything from the Teach Yourself books. And it was a very, very clear guide on how to calculate a horoscope and basically read it in through character description. And so I taught myself from that. My maths wasn't very good, but that's how I learned. So that's about 1973. And then I began to bother all my friends to find out their time and date of birth, and then calculate their horoscopes.
Side question to the point you're making there. Do you think it's still important these days for practicing astrologers or astrologers coming new into the field to learn how to calculate charts by hand? At Kepler, in order to graduate, you have to calculate charts by hand. Do you think that's still important? I know computerized, everything is computerized and it can be done instantly. Do you think there's still a connection we need to keep there, or what are your general thoughts?
I don't think it's absolutely necessary at all, but I think it's desirable on the same level as it's desirable for all crafts from the past to be kept alive. So that we know how to do things. I mean, the calculation of horoscopes that I learned in the 70s, hand calculation, you're still using logarithm tables and ephemerides. So if we were going to say, look, we've got to go back and do everything without any technology, we'd be going back to using astrolabes. Or even then, you might consider the astrolabe a piece of technology. You've just got to go back to purely visual observation. So it's not necessary to do the hand calculation, but I would say it's desirable to keep those skills alive because they will add an understanding of the process. I mean, I have to say, if I just add something else to that, I think it's also extremely important to watch the sky, because when you calculate a horoscope, you end up with a moon at say 16 degrees of Sagittarius, and you get the illusion it's a fixed point. I was watching the moon last night, and you watch the moon, you look away for 5 minutes, you look up again, it's moved, and you look away for 15 minutes, you look up again, you can't see it because it's moved behind a building. So it's constantly on the move. And so the universe that astrologers try to measure is a fluid, dynamic one. And I think a difficulty of the casting of horoscopes is you can end up with the illusion of a set of relationships that are fixed rather than fluid. But so I think, doing some hand calculations, but also watching the sky.
I think that's a wonderful point. And at Kepler, we have to go through an astronomy course as well, but understanding the movements of the heavens. You're not just looking at a phone with a 2D script. Take that phone outside and put it down and go look at the sky and the movements. I think that's just a wonderful point. And tying in with whether it's hand calculation or the astronomy, how important for astrologers, excuse me, to understand the history of astrology? And that's what we're going to talk about today.
Well, I mean, I think it's crucial because actually I think it's really important for everybody to understand the history of everything. And I point to politics. I'm not at all sure how people who have no understanding of the history of politics can play any part in politics, actually. And that affects us all. So as far as astrology is concerned, my commitment to studying the history of astrology, I can date it to about 1982, when there was I became aware of a lot of factionalization in astrology in England, with different schools of thought, claiming that members of other schools of thought weren't proper astrologers. And I was thinking, well, how can you say this? This is it's like replicating Christians saying that other Christians aren't proper Christians, or Marxists saying other Marxists aren't proper Marxists. It seemed to be kind of ludicrous. So I set out almost as a sort of enlightenment mission to show how all present views on astrology, which are quite diverse, have a history and a role in the past. And so, one of my fundamental political principles is toleration. People need to respect each other. And so my feeling back then was that the astrologers who were going around castigating each other should actually respect each other's positions. So that was my sense. I mean, mostly astrologers do all respect each other's positions, but sometimes you get outbreaks of factionalism. But I just think that, if you're a practicing astrologer, you're learning from a school of astrology, or you're reading textbooks, and you can end up thinking that what you're reading or being taught is some sort of objective truth that everybody knows, whereas in fact all those current positions are the result of centuries of innovation and adaptation. And so, I think it's really important to know that, particularly, if you're going to set out to advise clients, you need to know that what you are saying is not some absolute objective truth, but it has evolved and developed in association with other, parallel strands of information or knowledge or interpretation or method.
Absolutely. And going on those lines of thought, talking about the history of astrology, I've heard you talk about the history of astrology not being linear in development, but constantly in the present. Can you maybe expand on those thoughts?
Yeah, and I'm going to credit one of my wonderful PhD supervisors, Dr. Marion Bowman, who was a great specialist in the study of religion. And I was walking around Glastonbury with her one day, and there's all the mystical shops there. And I made a very dismissive comment about the books in the window of some shops, saying, oh, well, this is all made up in the present. And she actually said to me, Nick, it's all in the present. It's all now. So if we look at the case of, say, medieval astrology, if we look at the texts we've got available, then they may have been written a long time ago. They may be written in the 13th, 14th century, but they're available now. We are reading them now with our minds in the now. So, they've got a lineage and an ancestry and so on, but they exist now alongside, YouTube, alongside air travel, space travel, AI, fast food, everything. They're absolutely part of the culture we've got now. And the texts that we don't have, like there's many texts from the Middle Ages, astrological texts we don't have, many more from the classical era, and almost the whole of Babylonian astrology is lost. So those don't exist for us. They have no existence. So it's all present. So when we look at claims to authority or tradition, then we always have to remember that authority exists now. So astrology depends a huge amount on authority. And ideas are passed down from astrologer to astrologer and so on, from Ptolemy and Valens in the Hellenistic era downwards. And then there is some criticism of those ideas. They are, evaluated and revised, but still the body of knowledge comes down in terms of, authority. And so the authority that's laid down in modern astrology is still fundamental that laid down by 2000 years ago in terms of the fundamental meanings of the zodiac signs and planets. But it's all here now. So I think that just needs to be understood. And again, I think it breeds tolerance and understanding and humility. And so, you can't go around waving some sacred book and saying, this is what was said in 1600, or this is what is said in the 2nd century, and say, therefore, it's true.
Absolutely.
Another point, sorry, Cal, I'm just going to go on and make another point, which is a lot of the texts are, translated. So if we look at Hellenistic astrology, for example, then if we're English speakers, we're reading those texts in English, and so we're dependent on the translations. There's no secret about this, and everybody knows this, but it's always something to bear in mind that we're reading something that's not in the original, and therefore we might not have the original understanding of it. We've got a modern understanding of it.
I think it speaks to your incredible contributions to the field of astrology. And speaking about translations or lost text, how important do you think the likes of Project Hindsight has been the furtherment of astrology or understanding?
Well, I think Project Hindsight was great. I was around at the time when it started. I was at the dinner at the UAC conference in 1992 when, which was basically the starting moment. There was obviously a gradual process towards building up to it, but that was a crucial moment. And the translators for that project over the few years they were collaborating did do an incredible job in making available the mainly Greek texts, bit of Latin, bit of Arabic, bit of Hebrew, and for me, that was a historical exercise, to understand how, or to try to understand how Hellenistic astrology had functioned. I mean, one obvious point was just it brought home again the diversity. So this the spirit of the framework within which Ptolemy was working, which was very much to do with natural influences, was quite different to the one within which Valens was working, which was much more to do with the pure foundation in a geometrical universe, in my view. So that was all very important. Clearly, as well, the translations had a very powerful impact on the world of astrology in the English-speaking world. I'll say English-speaking because, of course, the whole project was conducted in English. In that it made a lot of astrologers feel that some earlier truth was being uncovered. If we look at the larger scale of things, right, 10 years before Project Hindsight, there'd been the beginnings of what we call the traditional revival in England, when the astrologer Olivia Berkeley bought an original copy of William Lilly's Christian Astrology, published in 1647, and made 100 photocopies of it. And she showed that this was completely or somewhat different to an edited version brought out of the 19th century. And this then triggered this huge interest in Lilly's version of medieval astrology. It really did create a huge interest. And Olivia Berkeley then traveled to the USA, and she played a part in that mood which led to the development of Project Hindsight, partly via influencing Robert Hand. So this whole process of rediscovery of the past goes back to 1982, and then hit a new level in 1992. So I know that there's what's happened since then is that the sort of classical Greek language astrology has sort of filtered into mainstream, and so it's become part of the diverse extent of modern astrology. So we've got, obviously, if you're a 20-year-old astrologer now, you're born 10 years after Project Hindsight, 30 years after the traditional revival. This is part of the environment you grew up in. And so I think we've got young astrologers now who are studying with a diverse range of schools. And so they might take a course in Hellenistic astrology, they might take a course in reincarnational astrology. So there's a sort of eclectic diversity, because back in 1992 there was this view amongst a lot of people that a pure form of astrology had been discovered. I know Robert Schmidt, who was one of the three leading figures in the movement, believed that there was a pure original Greek astrology, which was a pure original invention, which had then become diluted, so that by the 2nd century, we've got Valens and Ptolemy and so on. He thought, well, that the original tradition had become somewhat muddied, but I never quite bought into that, because there was a transmission of Babylonian astrology into the Greek world, and then there was innovation that took place in Egypt as well. So, but there was that sense. So Robert Schmidt's sense that there was like this original pure astrology really attracted people to the sense that here was something original and authentic that they could learn. Here was the original material, the primary material of astrology, that they could get to, freed from 2,000 years of innovation, sometimes muddle, mistranslations, people developing their own ideas, and so on.
Yeah, excuse me. I'm so grateful for the work that these brilliant astrologers have done, because as I came to Kepler, my foundation has really been leaning towards traditional astrology. And it wasn't until I started learning about essential dignity that I, in quotes, didn't get astrology, until I started learning about conditions of planets accidentally dignified or debilitated. And that was really the beginnings and the underpinnings of my understanding of astrology and where I lean towards.
Yes. You see, there's there's many ways of dividing astrology into different schools of thought, little sort of binaries. And one that I developed, I don't know, when I started off thinking about the history of astrology, I called technophobia and technophilia. So technophiles love more techniques in astrology. So they might be, gathered from the Hellenistic texts, or they might be modern and be, from German astrology, midpoints, the so-called hypothetical planets, and so on. Or they might be, as what was developed in the early 20th century, tertiary progressions, converse progressions, harmonic charts, and so on. And then you get other astrologers who want something really simple in their technical astrology, which seems, and those people I call the technophobes, because they don't get on with a lot of technique, and instead and they're drawn towards very much psychological astrology, where the technical use of astrology is very slight. A reference to Jupiter being conjunct Venus or something in the 9th house, and that's it. No talk of, planetary condition or divisions of the zodiac or anything else. And then the richness then comes, entirely in sort of reams of interpretation, drawing on, myths, Jungian psychology, and so on. So I think that's another another sort of dividing point when we look at contemporary astrology.
I think I've heard you talk about the likes of Kepler and Jung in terms of being active participants in astrology. And I think you were talking about, I actually want to ask you a question in terms of some of the arguments leveled against the older texts is they are written deterministically. But I think you make the point, speaking about Ptolemy, talking about, well, if we weren't able to change the future, there'd be no point in seeing an astrologer. Can you expand on those points?
Yes. So astrological texts are often written, even in the modern age, as if to say, you will do this. So the great textbooks of the mid 20th century, some of them always said, sort of people with Jupiter conjunct Mars have a fiery disposition. They're expansive. They're this, they're that. As if So the character is to some extent, even the personality description, predetermined. But so going back to Ptolemy, then he did say that if everything was fixed, there'd be no point in, if you were ill, in trying to be healed. And he was talking about the Egyptian temple priests, who are probably also practitioners of astrology. There's no point. And so I am of the opinion that all astrology assumes a fundamentally determined universe. That's not a difficult thing to say, because the astrology is based in astronomical measurements, and by Newtonian mechanics, the orbits of the planets around the sun, and hence also their positions geocentrically, can be fixed way in advance, which was how we come to have ephemerides. So that is fixed. The question is that people have discussed over the millennia without reaching a satisfactory solution to, is where in our world the boundary between that basic mechanics of the universe and the human capacity to think and identify their inner self and think freely and with intent, where that boundary is. So one option, all these options are actually set out in the classical era or the Babylonian era. So I'll start with the Babylonians, for whom the solution was to perform rituals. So in Babylonian astrology, and if there was a difficult prediction for the king, and until about 500 BC, we think that all astrology was actually conducted for the king, then the king could perform various rituals to satisfy the planetary deities to avert a threatened future. Then if we look at the classical era, then Plato, whose influence runs through all subsequent astrology, separated the rational conscious, or the rational soul, as he called it, from the animal and emotional soul. So in Plato's cosmology, the soul inhabits the stars, and then as it's incarnated, it descends through the planetary spheres into the material world, and the whole material world rests in psyche or soul or consciousness. So in the material world, we then have a emotional soul which feels, which gets upset or angry, an animal soul which lives, dies, needs to eat, gets hungry, thirsty. But the rational soul always maintains that connection with the stars that's free from the body. So wherever you get a platonically inclined astrology, then there's always space for absolute freedom of choice, separate to physical pressures. It's just as Plato argued, it's difficult to make those choices. So for him, the key lay in, leading a philosophical life, maintaining your physical and uh, psychic health. And that idea then fed into medieval European astrology, because medieval Europeans had a problem. Astrology became very popular in the 12th century when the Arabic texts were translated. And all those texts, including Ptolemy, being translated from Greek and Arabic, assumed that their natural influences on the psyche. Ptolemy writes about this. Big problem for Christianity, because the soul has to be only responsible to God. So a couple of medieval theologians, Thomas Aquinas, Albertus Magnus, formulated the idea that the soul, or the psyche, is responsible only to God. The planets influence the body, and the body can influence the mind. So you can have a Mars transit which heats up your body, can make you angry. But if you pray, if you lead a devout life, if you read your scriptures, then you will insulate yourself against those planetary influences. So this comes down to the modern world in all those forms of astrology which deal with the idea that there is a self which can make free decisions. Another group of people who are very influential in the classical world were the Stoics, for whom free choice was really limited, and at an extreme end they would say, look, your whole life is pretty much determined, and what you can do is you still got inner consciousness. So what you can do is control your responses to the outer world. So if something goes dramatically wrong in your world, again, Mars transit, you get a hot fever, get run over by a chariot or something, then the key is not to get worried about it. You accept it. This is my fate. So there's a strong level of external determinism there, but internally you can choose how to adjust. I mean, it's very much a Buddhist message as well. Don't get upset about it. So, and that kind of view is very current
And
as
I
well.
think it speaks to your point you made before about tolerance, and you were alluding towards politics. And I think I've heard you talk about Kepler seeing astrology as a tool for social and political stability and being an active participant. Can you expand on that point?
Being an active participant, yes. So again, I'll go back to Plato. The reason why we go back to Plato actually is because quite rarely for Greek philosophers, all his work survived through to the modern era, with interruptions, and were incredibly influential. So, in his view, you had to, lead an ethical life, within what later astrologers identified as the astrological universe. Lead an ethical life, engage and participate on that level. He had a view of how politics should be organized and so on. You mentioned Kepler, and Kepler was a great believer in the two things. First of all, the fact that natural influences run through the whole world, and that God is the ruler of everything. So one thing that he wrote struck me as really important. We've got some of his surviving political predictions, and he was looking at an upcoming difficult transit, and he said, let the causes of discontent be addressed. I'm paraphrasing him there, which seems to me to be the origin of a sort of modern leftish, social democratish political view in which you avoid revolution by addressing problems in society. You alleviate poverty, you allow people to have a education and so on. So that was a way of interacting and engaging through astrology. I mean, modern Western astrologers have really lost this. In Indian astrology still, you engage through sort of going to the temple, through having your astrologer make talismans for you, and going to the temple to perform pujas, purifications. So still there's very active engagement on that level, but Western astrology has very much lost this practical engagement, on many levels.
Thank you. So now switching onto your esteemed world in the academic field, I want to talk now about the disdain towards astrology. And I think you've talked before about most commentary on astrology coming from non-specialists, journalists, and critics who deem astrology either as a quasi-religion or a pseudo-science. Number one, what's been your role in the academic field, and has there been any pushback in terms of researching the field of astrology? How has that experience been for you over the years?
Well, I mean, as I said, I really got hooked on being a historian of astrology in 1982, and that was initially to sort out or to deal with disputes between astrologers, but then I began to look at what wider research there was into astrology by sociologists, psychologists, and so on. It was very little. In the 1970s, there was some scientific research which got very high profile, but the sociological material, you had to dig around to find it. There was a seminal paper, or book actually, written by Theodore Adorno, a major sociologist, called The Stars Down to Earth, and he did a study of the Los Angeles Times horoscope column it was in the 1950s, and he argued that what people who read horoscope columns are doing, so this is the sun sign column, are giving authority over their lives to a higher power, in this case the power of the stars. And he said this is pretty much like fascism, where people give over power of their lives to a higher authority in the form of the fascist leader. And this seemed to me to be fundamentally absurd, because I'd by then, myself been, that's how my seminal experience at the age of 6 was, being read astrology columns by my mother. At no stage did I ever think, oh, I'm going to give over power over my life to a higher power, and then I'm going to become a fascist.
A fascist. I was going to say it's a really strong word and ridiculous term to level to astrology.
For Adorno, astrology was a gateway drug to fascism. And I thought, hey, that's nonsense. And also, by then I knew lots of astrologers, and they were generally, rather, some conservatives, some on the left, they're generally rather laid back people. And so, but this idea of Adorno's fed into sociology and fed into the area of cultural studies, where the starting point for what little research there was to establish why astrologers or fans of astrology or believers in astrology are insecure people who need astrology to provide some security for them. So then you end up with research saying that believers in astrology are marginal people, which meant at that time, we're going back to the 1970s, Latinos, African Americans, and women And of course, from a perspective now, you realize how absurd such a statement is and how conditioned by the cultural prejudice of the time. But nevertheless, the idea that astrologers are somehow weak-minded people who need a crutch is still very persistent by people who follow in this line of thought. So much so that back in the 70s, there were astronomers in America who were worried about interest in astrology undermining American democracy, because you've got these people, believers in astrology, who are unable to take a free choice, and democracy depends on making a free choice, which party to support, and astrologers are unable to make that choice, and therefore they're a danger to democracy. So another twist on the astrology is a gateway to fascism hypothesis. Another thing people say is that so astrology is a quasi-religion, to which I ask, what on earth is a quasi-religion? The people who make that statement are usually atheists who think that religion is a lot of rubbish anyway. So to call something a quasi-religion kind of means it doesn't even qualify as a load of rubbish. And I was watching a YouTube video on this very discussion the other day, where the idea of the substitution hypothesis came up. And this is, the idea that if you stop believing in religion, you'll believe in any old nonsense. And then astrology rushes in. The person who was making this statement had just spent the previous hour saying that astrology itself is a load of old rubbish. So there's this idea. It's called a substitution hypothesis, which makes it sound rather grand psychologically. In fact, it itself is nonsense, because it starts off from the premise that we actually know exactly what a religion is, and religions do not have, there's no precise definition of what a religion is. Now people think about, well, there's Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, where there's a supernatural creator. Okay, so a religion has a supernatural creator, but hang on, what about Buddhism? Some forms of Buddhism are atheist. So where's the supernatural creator there? There is no God. They're atheist. And then you go to, as critics of Marxism did in the 60s, saying, well, Marxism is a religion because it sets up, an all-encompassing worldview through which everything is interpreted, but it's devoid of any evidence. So the whole question of what is a religion becomes very vague, and then within the study of religions area, now people will tend to talk about, say, worldview. So once people start complaining about astrology being a religion, then say if it's not, it's a quasi-religion. In academic terms, they're talking total and utter nonsense. And they've failed to actually read the basic textbooks or walk down the corridor in the university to ask somebody, an expert on religion, what's going on. I mean, the same thing happens with when astrology is called a pseudoscience. So there are different definitions of science, and the way that astrologers usually talk about astrology as a science is in a traditional definition in which a science is a discipline with its own rules, and it can then yield some truth. But other examples of science given in such terms are horse racing and boxing. So astrologers have often said astrology is a science, and that's what they mean, a discipline with its own rules. So along comes a later definition of science, which is the scientific method. So experimental method, control groups, levels of statistical reliability, and so on. And astrology fails to meet those criteria. So it's called a pseudoscience. But hang on, astrology never claimed to meet those criteria in the first place. and before we leave that point, there's also the problem that we've got theories in modern science that can count as equally pseudoscience. One is, the many worlds hypothesis, in which at its extreme, every time we have a thought, there's a split in the universe and a new universe is created. So again, there's a lot of rhetorical criticism of astrology that really annoys me, because I believe in good scholarship. And if you criticize something, you actually need to know what you're talking about. You need to read the texts to start off with. You need to pick up some literature on astrology or talk to some astrologers before you start.
It's a really great point, and it goes back to your point about being a non-specialist. I can't dream of, talking about a subject I have no idea about or haven't studied, hadn't read about. I just think that's just bizarre.
Well, it is, but there's a hierarchy in academic disciplines, or self-identified hierarchies, and some scientists place science at the top of that. So they go, they talk on and about, science as, being, wonderful description of the universe. It's beautiful. It's the ultimate arbiter of what's true, and so on. But I come from a historical background, and in my view, history is the ultimate skeptical discipline. You're taught as a historian to read the texts or to listen to people, to look at the artifacts and critique them. And so, you can look at the history of science and critique that. I mean, a lot of scientists will say, well, sure, science evolves, but our current theories and models are the best guess we've got. But what a historian would say was, well, hang on, what's coming next? As well as critiquing the general world of scientific experimentation as we have it at the moment, where there's a huge problem with researchers in universities being required to produce huge amounts of research, and a lot of the research is done with very small samples. It's not replicated, and so on. I mean, these are problems which some scientists are addressing. But so I'm going to, for rhetorical means, declare history to be the queen of the academic disciplines, or the king of the academic disciplines, or both.
Fantastic. Thank you for explaining that. And I want to switch briefly onto planetary cycles, bring it more to the modern day. How important do you think it is for astrologers to pay attention to great cycles? I think I've heard you talk about specifically about the era of, say, 1968, and just watching these planetary cycles. Can you expand on some of the points you've made before?
So let me give a little bit of an introduction to that point. Look, astrology works, in quote marks, in different ways, and one way it works is just through a person experiencing that moment when astrology appears to be true, reading something, or when they're in an astrological consultation, and so on. It's just in that moment. But Kepler said, look, we've got to get around this problem somehow. Look at planetary cycles. We can measure, planetary cycles. So in his astrology, he although he did continue to work as a horoscopic astrologer, for which he was employed, but in his sort of proposed reform of astrology, he said we have to completely abandon zodiac signs, the entire structure of the horoscope, except for planetary cycles and planetary aspects, the geometrical relationships between the planets as seen from Earth. Of course, he knew that by then the Earth goes around the sun, but the geocentric model, and we live on the Earth, so that's fine. And that always seems to me to be it's always struck me as a very interesting way of looking at astrology, to see if there is some Keplerian correlation. And so I think I wish Kepler was here to talk about this, because I think he would be very happy if he knew about Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. He'd be very happy to look at the those outer planet conjunctions in the mid-60s, coinciding with the countercultural movement in the West, Cultural Revolution in China, etc. And then the late 80s, early 90s, with the disintegration of communism and so on. So I do find that very intriguing, and I really haven't actually looked at that work really for about 20 years, which is when my academic career became all consuming. But I do find it fascinating, and I so that's Keplerian astrology. As to whether it's important for astrologers to understand it, I think it's important for them to understand the history of astrology. So Kepler's idea that all planets are in aspect almost all the time, because they're always in some sort of geometrical relationship, is the one developed by Dane Rudhyar, when he said all planets are in a phase relationship for Dane Rudhyar. And so if you read Rudhyar, and I don't know if people still do read him, then Kepler and that whole conceptual shift that Kepler organized stands in the background.
Fantastic. Now, switching onto your incredible body of work over the decades, I think in any part of any astrologer's library has to be a history of Western astrology, which we've got here. And I think if we went through all of your work, we'd have sit here for about 10 hours. But I'd like to ask you, out of all your accomplishments, what are you most proud of?
In terms of my professional career, I am, I think, proud of my body of work in the history of astrology, and in, I think, making the case that there's a intelligent response to the existence of astrology in the modern world. So challenging that idea that people interested in astrology have to be marginal in some way, insecure, psychologically weak, or the idea that astrology died out in the 17th century or something, and recognizing that it's a absolutely major part of popular culture, mass culture, and therefore needs to be understood on that level. As I said, I get very upset when academics weigh in with their prejudice about anything, because it seems to me to be, that's an abandonment of scholarship. And I believe, we human beings were put here to think, and think critically, and to question things. So I think I've done some decent work in arguing that astrology needs to be understood as a feature of modern culture, and that this needs to be lived with. Same with anything else. Anything else we've got in our modern culture is a part of modern culture. Fast food, Hollywood movies, AI, foreign holidays, whatever. They're all part of modern culture. So I've done that. I've also, as part of that, very pleased with the PhDs that I've supervised, because a PhD is 100,000 word piece of research on a research question. I've supervised quite a few that deal with modern astrology, and I've got others I'm supervising at the moment. So, for example, Francis Klein's produced a really important study on computerization in astrology. and Bernadette Brady did a seminal study of beliefs about fate amongst astrologers. Laura Andrikopoulos did a study of psychologization in 20th century astrology. Gary Phillipson did a major study on how astrologers understand truth, how we can apply truth theory to modern astrology. I've helped produce this body of work again, which means that it's not just me that's contributed with my work to, I think, a better understanding of and a fairer understanding of the cultural position of modern astrology, but this other body of work as well, which is ongoing.
Absolutely remarkable. Speaking as we've been doing of the history of astrology, where do you see astrology heading in the next 50, 100, 150 years from now? Do you have any general thoughts about the future of astrology? You've alluded to before about the use of technology now and how we can be interconnected around the world. We can have clients around the world. What are your general thoughts about the future of astrology?
Yeah, I mean, where it's going to go, methodologically, in terms of its theory, I'd say it's going to keep recycling the past, because I don't see where there's much more scope for technical or interpretative innovation within astrology. And if everything we've got now has a 2,000-year-old ancestry, we're going to keep reformulating the past. It can be reformulated in terms of present contexts, but it seems to me that a lot of the developments in astrology have been technologically driven. So we can point to the beginning of the printing press in the mid 15th century, which then allowed the publication of almanacs. And every European town had its almanacs, and almanacs could be produced monthly or frequently annually, and they all contained some astrological information, obviously frequently other information as well, the weather, recipes, whatever, just like any modern magazine. And then so you've had these major technological leaps in the last few decades, beginning with computerization. So you can cast a horoscope without having to do the half hour of laborious calculation with your logarithmic tables and so on. And then phone line horoscopes in the late 1980s, which did a huge amount to promote astrology, because people used to phone up their phone line beginning in about 1987, 88. And you could phone up to get a recipe for the day or whatever, but there were horoscope phone lines. People would phone up, get a reading, sometimes for a day, usually for the week. And this was huge business for a few years until companies got wise to the fact that people were calling from work, and so introduced call blocking. And I think the novelty wore off as well. But the result of that in the late 80s was that magazines and newspapers that were running horoscope columns put huge promotion into them. But so the technology drove that promotion. And then, we move on, and we've got now, social media, as you said. You can be sitting in Idaho and have a client in Kuala Lumpur. Whereas until this point, if you were a professional astrologer, you really needed to live in a big city to make a living, unless you were particularly lucky. You needed to live in Los Angeles, New York, London, Paris, etc. If you lived in some little village miles to nowhere, you didn't have any clients. So all that's radically changed. I think that's a pretty huge change. And now there's astrology apps. What I've heard is that it's the Indians who are developing a lot of the astrology apps. So again, there's a globalization, and the ongoing spread of Western astrology as well. I think, what the thing about Western astrology is it provides this language of the birth signs that's very, very easy and simple to grasp. Chinese astrology never had such a simple language. Indian astrology, which has very much the same technical ancestry as Western astrology, again, didn't develop this language. So it comes from the West. So there's that entry point. Am I a Taurian? Am I a Gemini? Almost everybody can know this, even if they have no other interest in astrology at all. So I think that's facilitating the spread of Western astrology.
And speaking about that point, and you've talked about this before, about what is the importance throughout the history of astrology of sharing and the transmission of knowledge? Because I think I've heard you talk about the foundations of Baghdad, and I believe in talking about an Indian astrologer who's involved. I'm not quite sure the story. Can you explain that to the audience?
Yes. This is one of the great examples of a city being founded using astrology. We've got other stories about cities being founded using astrology, but without the clinching evidence. Whereas Baghdad, we know there was a committee of astrologers. Baghdad was founded as the new capital of the Islamic, Arabic, Persian Empire, which by then it was huge, extending from Spain through North Africa to the edges of India. So we're dealing with a massive empire, huge. So the Caliph decided he needed a new capital, and the new capital was actually circular, with 4 gates, and a committee of astrologers worked out the horoscope for the first moment of construction, and this included an Indian astrologer. And when I wrote about this, then it was clear to me that there was a malefic planetary presence in the birth chart in terms of Greek Western astrology, which no astrologer could have permitted. But in Indian astrology, that same factor was a benefic. And so, I think that's an instance where, as a historian, I brought my personal knowledge of the technical processes of astrology to bear, and then I could make the argument clearly that there was a meeting of a synthesis of the Indian and the Western traditions.
Quite remarkable. If I remember that chart correctly, you've got Sagittarius rising. I think you've got Jupiter on the ascendant. I think the malefic was Mars. Is that correct? In the opposition to the ascendant, and that's very, very tight. And that Jupiter in the trine to the Sun. But I think that's a wonderful example. So thank you for sharing.
You are correct. It was the malefic Mars which became benefic in Indian astrology.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that example. Absolutely wonderful. And can you speak a little bit, switching gears, onto your incredible work with the MA program, and later on talk about your work with the Sophia Center?
Yes. So the MA in cultural astronomy and astrology. I after sort of developing a very broad perspective on the history of astrology, I came across this emerging discipline of cultural astronomy. So astronomers who are interested in astronomy and the arts, literature, any aspect of culture. My entry point into that was hearing about the conferences on the inspiration of astronomical phenomena. The first of these series of conferences were held in the 1990s in Castel Gandolfo, just outside Rome, and it was organized by a group of 3 astronomers, including the Vatican astronomer, who are tired of going to astronomers where everybody just talked mathematics, to going to conferences where everybody just talked mathematics. So they organized this conference. I unfortunately didn't go to that one, but I went to the next one, which I think was in 1999 in Malta. And I got hooked. I thought this was wonderful. So I had this fascination for the sky. And I'll tell you another anecdote about my mother. Not only did she read the horoscopes out at breakfast, but she also loved looking at the sky. I remember her gazing at the moon, looking at the moon. I was probably about 20 at that point, just entranced by it. It was a full moon. And I was also entranced. And I thought, oh, that's great. One can be entranced by the sky, enchanted by it. So here were these periodic conferences devoted to the ways in which people have been enchanted by the sky, then articulated this in poetry, the arts, etc. And this seemed to me to be a much bigger way of locating astrology as the search for meaning and significance in the sky in a particular form, in a much broader context. And then from there, I discovered the Oxford conferences in archaeoastronomy and cultural astronomy, became a regular there as well. There's an annual conference in Europe, the Society of the European Study of Astronomy and Culture. So that gives me, another sort of outlet. It's really a different network. We've got a network of historians of astrology, and then the network of people interested in astronomy and culture. In my mind, everything overlaps. I can't see the boundary between the two. So I, in the mid-90s, I decided that I needed some structure to my life as a historian of astrology. So I thought, well, how do I do this? Do a PhD. I get involved with an organized group of people. If you go to university, there's your community who can critique you, guide you, comment on your work, and so on. So in 1997, I started doing a PhD in the study of religions department at a little new university in England called Bath Spa University. And where one of my supervisors was Marion Bowman, who I mentioned earlier. And my topic was the extent and nature of contemporary belief in astrology. I chose this topic because I was increasingly the focus of journalists who were writing a story on astrology. They'd phone up and say, how many people believe in astrology and why? The editor wants to know. And I give some kind of answer. And then I realized that actually nobody had the answer. So I thought, well, go and do a PhD. And this took 6 years. And I gathered a huge amount of information and wrote a PhD, in the process of which along the way I realized that to ask how many people believe in astrology is not a useful starting question, because belief is pretty difficult to measure. Belief is a nebulous concept. You try and put a percentage on it, like 25% of people believe in astrology. It's kind of meaningless, because what is belief? How do you quantify belief? So there are different ways of asking about people's attitudes to astrology, and I found out that if you ask people different questions, you get different answers. So
I believe it wasn't part of the PhD. Didn't you go to conferences and speak to practicing astrologers? Was that part of the PhD? Is that correct?
Yeah, it was. So I did research with astrologers. So I went to conferences, the Astrological Association conference in the UK, the ISAR conference in the US, the UAC conference. I distributed my questionnaires. I got several thousand questionnaires back. I did interviews with about 60 astrologers. And so, I put my academic hat on and sort of thought, I'll study this community, a community which I knew obviously very well. So I'll study it. And I got, I think I got, that was the first time anybody done that, actually. That was the first time anybody had actually talked to astrologers as part of research, rather than saying, oh, they're all insecure. No, I correct.
That's mind-blowing to me. That's the first time, anyway, out of all of the commentary about astrology, that the first time actually people have gone to astrologers and actually asked questions. That's mind-blowing.
Actually, I will correct that. There was one previous study. Somebody went to a UAC conference in New Orleans in the late 80s and wrote one chapter on that. But mine was the first PhD. Yeah, I mean, what I found out quite simply was that astrologers can talk intelligently. They've got diverse opinions. They've got different political views, and they have, different ways of describing astrology. So I gave them multiple choice questions. Do you think astrology is a symbolic language, a science, a form of psychology, and so on? And of course, what I found from that is that a lot of astrologers can hold, contradictory statements at the same time, and why not? Because everybody does. So they're normal people. Yeah, my main conclusion was that astrology is a part of modern popular culture, and so that's it, and deserves to be looked at sensibly in that light, along with any other part of modern culture.
Absolutely, absolutely. And can you talk about your work with the Sophia Center? The director, is that correct? Am I getting that right?
Yes. Right. So we set up the center at Bath Spa University in 2002 as a center within which we taught the MA in Cultural Astronomy and Astrology. And then it sort of has like, autonomy. The first director was Michael York, who was mainly known as a sociologist of the New Age, and was being knowledgeable about astrology. And then I took over from him in 2004. In 2007, we moved to the University of Wales, now the University of Wales Trinity St David, where we reside. So the centre has a kind of autonomous existence in the university, although I'm a member of the Institute of Humanities and Education, so I'm sort of fully a part of that whole university structure. And we have an autonomous existence, a set of guidelines and so on, but very much part of the university.
Wonderful. And I'd actually like to talk about your involvement with KeplerCollege in the past. So can you speak to that?
Yes. So, KeplerCollege, as we know, the idea of it came together in the early to mid 90s as a means of providing degree courses for astrologers. And so I was part of the team along with Rob Hand and Demetra George, and then Lee Lehman came in as well, to develop the first year of the BA program, which was on the history of astrology, because our principle was that we needed to teach the history of astrology first as a foundation for any education in practical astrology. And when it came to teaching practical astrology, which I wasn't involved in, then the principle was, we would teach everything. There was no judgment between anything. Some Indian astrology, some psychological astrology, some horror astrology, and so on. So it was a broad curriculum in which at no time did anybody ever say, well, this kind of astrology is better than that or whatever. And everything then rested in these classes in the history of astrology. We went right from the Babylonians to the modern period. And then we had briefly the MA program. And there was some fabulous students. It was a great period. And then unfortunately, it was just not we had authorization to teach, but we couldn't get the next tier, which was accreditation. In Washington State at that time, there were two tiers of like regulation of degree courses: authorization, where you could begin to teach, and then accreditation, where the degree was actually accredited by one of the degree accrediting bodies. And then we found it very difficult to get accreditation. And one reason was that the bodies we approached said, well, we don't have anybody with the expertise to accredit your program. So we were kind of stuck. And then Washington State, I think they reduced the limit, that time limit between authorization and accreditation, so it didn't exist, and they effectively became the same thing. So because we weren't accredited, the program had to close. But the development of that program did provide a foundation for me in terms of the course material for when we launched the MA program in the UK in 2002. I got that 2 years of experience. So those were great days in Kepler College. The weekly symposia 3 times a year, where everybody came together in the Seattle region, and it was a great venture. And the reason it didn't succeed was because of that educational bureaucracy we couldn't actually overcome. So it's great to see Kepler still teaching anyway. And of course, who knows, one day a degree program might be possible again.
That'll be absolutely wonderful. And I think obviously Lee's back with us doing the medical program and people coming around. So absolutely, absolutely wonderful. Thank you for sharing that history. And I'm very thankful for your time today. So this is going to be my last question. What future plans do you have? What's going on right now and what's coming up for
you? My plans are often based upon the day-to-day minutiae of what I've done and what I'm doing. And so right at the moment, I've got another book on the history of astrology on the go. Be a short book, and I'm currently working out how I can make it different to my other work. I've got lots of editing and publishing projects. I'm just finishing off a book chapter at the moment, actually, on 10,000 words on 19th century astrology, which I'm revisiting and shaping slightly for a new publication. I've always got endless publications on the go. I just published a book chapter on looking at Western astrology as a form of indigenous knowledge, taking that idea of indigeneity and saying, well, here you go. So my big plan is really to keep going as long as I can. When I was about 35 years old, I had a brief connection with a man called Ronald Harvey, who was around in the British astrological scene, a keen thinker, very broad ideas. And in his mid-90s, he was still writing another book. And I'd go around and visit him, and he'd show me his manuscripts and so on. And then he died quite soon. So my big plan is actually to carry on what I'm doing, reading and writing, and then to die in mid-sentence. I think it would be a great way to go. And I'm completely at home with that, and that's my mission. I want to carry on producing the kind of work I'm producing, and because I love it. I also, by the way, here's something a little bit different. I'll tell you, just to lighten things somewhat. Once a week, I play poker with a group of friends.
Your 5 card or your Texas? Which do you like?
We play great variety.
Okay.
Omaha, 7-card stud, and then games we've made up ourselves. And so we're playing tonight. It's a Thursday. I dance the Argentinian tango. So last night, this being the summer, there's a weekly open air dance down in the public square. And it's great because there's kids playing around and people stop and take photos and so on. So I do that once a week.
At least you've got the weather now in England as well.
Briefly.
Briefly.
And then recently I took up the guitar. I can strum a few chords. That's been like it's been a huge entry point into me, just the understanding of the of music actually and sound and so on. And I also
It's quite interesting you bring up music, because a lot of astrologers I've spoken to, the likes of Michael Erlewine, Rick Levine, you know, he does a lot with harmonics, and just a lot of astrologers' connection with music. And maybe, I don't know if I'm articulating this point very well, but just the sounds it makes, whether it's discordant or beautifully sounding. I find a lot of astrologers have a real interest in music.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, all I can say is that my late coming to music has really, I think, opened up my mind to a whole new dimension of the universe. I don't even feel articulate enough to talk about this at the moment. It's just something inspirational. And from that process, actually, I also started playing around with words, and I've written a few poems. I've even written a few songs. So I love that different kind of writing as well. I've got a few couple of friends. We get together and they show me bits and pieces on the guitar, and I sing their songs and so on. So there's a whole another sort of creative aspect to my life that's opened up in the last few years as well. That's different to what I do most of my day, which is read books and then write articles. So so that's going on. So I'm going to take that forward, and so look, I might die mid-sentence writing a book, but I might also, if I can die in another way, it'll be mid-song, halfway through singing a song.
Well, hopefully no time soon. A long ways off. Wonderful.
So that's what I'm going to do. That's my big plan.
Fantastic. Well, Nick, it's been an absolute honor and a privilege to speak with one of the greats. And on behalf of Kepler College, thank you so much for sharing your time, your insights, and your wisdom with us today. And thank you very much.
Okay, Callum, it's been great.
Wonderful. Thank you all for watching. We'll see you again soon. Bye.